played any arena-style fighting games like Naruto, Dissidia, etc.? And if so, what are your opinions on them? How do you think they could be interesting if you don't necessarily like them?
I've dabbled with a couple of the typical arena style fighting game, right? You have the Dragon Ball series with like what is Tenkaichi and Budokai and those games, the Cyber Connect games for Naruto. I want to say Cyber Connect has done a bunch of the games in this space. In terms of my experience with arena fighters, the one that I've played the most is Gundam Versus. I played a little bit of the Gundam Versus release on PS4 as well as EX versus Maxi Boost on. That's the one that I've played the most of. I'm not an experienced Gundam player, but I know a thing or two, and I've played it with some of our locals before, and I love the game. I think it's fantastic. I don't like most arena fighters because the thing about arena fighters is that they make a lot of decisions in order to present the gameplay and specifically the actions that the characters in the game are performing as in a way that's as visually impressive as possible, because they're usually meant to be games that are built for a licensed IP. There's an old rule in game development, which is basically that the camera is the most important thing in a game, and everything you decide when you're making a game falls out of how you decide the camera should work. And if you think about it, when you think about the nature of a game genre, they are defined in large part by their cameras. We have first-person shooter, which is different from a third-person shooter. And usually, one of the core differences is that a first-person shooter is about aiming because you are aiming the camera. And in a third-person shooter, the aiming action is never going to be quite as refined. So you'll have a little bit more bullet tracking or auto aim or aim assist or whatever you want to call it, because the point is not that it's all about aiming, it's about watching a character aim. Or use a chainsaw. Same thing when you look at fighting games, right? 2D and 3D don't just have implications around the art style, it also does have implications around what the camera is doing, and specifically whether there's a Z-axis to worry about, right? Whether you have a foreground and a background, stuff like that. The thing about arena fighters is they are games where the point of the genre is to show off the cool animations that you probably saw in an anime. Those kinds of attacks are really cool when you watch them in a cartoon, and they're less cool to me if you have to watch them every single time you're trying to play a game. So a good example of this would be something like the finishing moves in Naruto, right? All the crazy attacks that they learn. It is very cool to see those characters do those things in a video game once, or maybe 3 times at most. Which is why when a new Naruto game comes out, I do watch all of the attack cutscenes because I think it's really cool to see, oh, I remember when this character did that thing and it was so cool because they learned this move, right? You never get to see them do it, and blah, 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 right? I love that shit in anime. But it kind of ruins the flow of a match for me. And the hard thing about that, like the cost that they pay in designing the game to emphasize this presentation, one of them is timing, obviously, right? Fighting games, the action usually goes quick because you want to get back to a point where you're making decisions again. And when you're doing a game that pays homage to the way this attack looked in an anime, you can't do things as quickly. But the other thing is, if you look at the screen of a 2D fighting game, right, or even a 3D fighting game, but a traditional fighting game, the screen is like the game board. And you get to see where one character is, you get to see where the other character is, you can see the space between the two characters. When you stick it out and attack, you can see roughly where you would expect that attack to hit, right? You can't see the hitboxes and hurtboxes yourself when you're playing the game, but you can look at the attack and go, oh, I think I can see where this would hit. In 3 dimensions, that is much harder. It's much harder to present an attack that has the hitboxes and hurtboxes, and they're clearly visible, right? The attack space is clearly visible, because when you're moving around in 3D, you can't always see the same angle on an attack, right? Fighting games typically use very fixed camera angles so that the attack information is consistent and it's easy to see. It's not always easy to see, but it's easier to see than it is in arena games. One of the consequences of a fighting game being built to display kind of the clarity of the attack animation rather than the full cinematic splendor is that you can look at where an attack is and go, oh, I can kind of get an idea of where this is, like where it's going to hit me, how fast it is, whether I need to block left or right or high or low or whatever. And in arena games, it's harder to do stuff like that because you can't always guarantee that you're seeing the important part of the attack. What that does is it makes the fighting game feel a lot less layered and subtle and nuanced and interesting, because the timing and spacing properties of any given attack just don't have as much detail, and the detail is often not as easy to see. So when you're making decisions against the opponent in an arena fighter, it doesn't always feel that satisfying because it doesn't always look that clear. It just kind of feels like you're pressing some buttons and they're pressing some buttons, and sometimes your attacks beat their attacks, and sometimes their attacks beat your attacks. But it can be pretty challenging, I think, to get that clear, precise perspective that a classic fighting game gives you. And it's one of the reasons why I love classic style fighting games. That said, I really love Gundam Versus. I think it's a great game. I think it nails the combat fantasy. I think that the traditional fighting game works well for when you're looking at two people fighting. But Gundams are robots, and they fly around all the time. So keeping Gundams confined to a traditional fighting game screen space doesn't feel right. I love Endless Duel. I played a little bit of Gundam Battle Assault as well, but those games don't feel like they nail the Gundam combat fantasy the way that Bandai Namco's Gundam Versus series does. That said, Gundam Versus also showcases plenty of the frustrating points of playing a competitive arena fighting game. And one of the biggest things for me is that, so Gundam Versus is a 2v2 kind of robot flying game. There are melee attacks, but a lot of the space control and a lot of the movement is forced by projectiles, right? Gundams usually have guns and missiles and lasers and all kinds of other stuff. A lot of the match is getting shot at by attacks that will put you in hit stun and lock you up, right? So you can end up in hit stun for sometimes like double-digit seconds if you end up getting like melee comboed or something. So there's a lot of attacks on the screen and you're trying to dodge them, but because you can't see everything at once, because there are two people shooting at you and you can't look at the entire screen at once the way you can in a fighting game, you will often find that a lot of the learning curve in the game is figuring out how to read the UI to get an idea of what attacks are about to hit you. And in order to do that, you need to know how the attacks from your opponent's Gundams behaved, so you can get an idea of what's the range on this thing, or how does it track, or what direction do I need to juke it in. And you often can't even see the attacks before they hit you because they're off screen. So you have to develop a lot of experience to get to the point where getting hit doesn't feel like a surprise. And every time you get surprised by a hit in that game, you're denied agency to control your character for often several seconds. So it doesn't feel the best. It can be very, very frustrating. Even as someone who's routinely used to playing frustrating games, the feeling of getting stun locked from what felt like a stray hit and then just getting comboed up afterwards from something I couldn't even see was pretty harsh. Not every game is for everyone, obviously, and I think if Gundam Versus came out and got like a proper local release and got some good support, we actually had like a current version on console, hey, that would be amazing. But there's definitely an aspect of the traditional fighting game camera that lets it play as smoothly as a competitive game as it does. When you look at games that don't have as tight a controller of the camera, or they use the camera to accentuate the cool shit that the characters are doing, it can get a little bit harder to get a satisfying competitive experience out of it.